Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker is Sebastian Rödl from University of Leipzig, speaking on universality, opposition, and the human individual.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Intriguing conference. When we consider the formula thinking and being, we encounter a difficulty. The formula appears to oppose thinking to being, and therewith to place thinking outside being. It appears to imply that thinking is not something that is. In consequence, it appears to place the thinker outside being. It appears to imply that the thinker is not something that is. In this essay, I meditate on this difficulty. After expounding the difficulty in section 1, I consider in section 2 the response to it of the sober man. The sober man reinterprets the formula thinking and being as speaking of something that is and something else that is. Someone's thinking that snow is white, as the case may be. That is something that is. And snow's being white. That is something else that is. Seeing that this reinterpretation yields nonsense all over, we shall want to understand the source of our formula. I describe it in section 3. The formula speaks the self-consciousness of thought. Thinking, thinking, thinking. It emerges that, contra the sober man, thinking, thinking is not thinking something that is. Rather, thinking, thinking is thinking, being. In section 4, I conclude by dissolving the difficulty with which I began. There is no task of locating thinking within being, no danger that it may find itself expulsed from being. There is no such task and no such danger, because being is thought only in thought thinking itself. Therewith it is thought and is thought only as that opposition, thinking and being. I end by noting that the same must hold true of the thinker. There is never occasion to be anxious how I might place the thinker I encounter within being. For it is and is only in encountering a thinker that being is opened up to me. Section 1, thinking and being. This formula is familiar to any student of philosophy. Indeed, there's an array of formulae which the student of philosophy cannot fail to encounter. Knowledge and reality, subject and object, mind and world, word and object. Anyone further along in the study of philosophy will be able to extend the list. So inescapable are these formulae that they can be called the formulae of philosophy. Not only in Parmenides' declaration that thinking and being are the same, but whenever thought takes its bearing from one of these formulae, philosophy dawns. But the formulae are curious, for in each case, the second term is what I will call universal. I introduced the universal idea by contrasting it to a general concept. A concept is determinate. Its determinacy is its content. It may be considered from two sides. A concept is determinate and it determines. A concept is determinate as it differs from other concepts. Being white is not the same as being heavy. A concept determines, namely what is thought through it, as it is a capacity to distinguish thing from thing. What is heavy, being heavy, differs from what is not heavy. Thus, the determinacy of a concept is a double difference. The difference of the concept from other concepts, the difference of one so from other so's, and the difference of what is thought through the concept from what cannot be thought through it, the difference of what is so from what is not so. The consciousness of this double difference is but one consciousness. It is the determinacy of the concept, the consciousness of it as determinate and thereby determining. A determinate concept may be more or less general. We ascend from a given concept to a more general one as we strip away determinations that the former contains. We abstract from these, as it may be put, or perhaps better, we abstract the more general concept from the less general one. Just as the concept from which it is abstracted, the abstracted concept has a content. Its content is thinner, yet it has a content. It differs from other concepts, and it is a capacity to distinguish what is thought through it from what is not. Abstraction moves from content to content. Now, we may contemplate stripping a concept, not of certain of its determinations, but of all determinacy. Call this the absolute abstraction. It may seem that the absolute abstraction is a specially thorough form of abstraction. It carries abstraction as far as is at all possible. However, precisely because it takes abstraction to its limit, the absolute abstraction is no abstraction. Absolute abstraction annihilates all content and thus all difference of one concept from another. Hence, it does not proceed from any particular concept. It does not use, and therefore does not require, anything a particular concept would give. On the contrary, it repels any determination that would be so given. The absolute abstraction abstracts from any determination and thus annihilates all difference of one concept from another. Therefore, in contrast to an abstracted concept, the absolute abstraction has no content. It is not a concept differing from other concepts. It does not distinguish thing from thing. Thinking something through the absolute abstraction is not thinking it not to be otherwise than therein it is thought to be. The absolute abstraction is not a particularly thorough form of abstraction. It is no abstraction at all. It is not an element, a fortiori not the last element, in a series of concepts of ascending generality. It is not more general than concepts falling within such a series. Indeed, the absolute abstraction is not general at all. It cannot be introduced by examples presented so as to draw attention to something they have in common. For it abstracts from all determination and thus from everything that something could have in common with something. In this way, the absolute abstraction is unique. I mark its uniqueness by calling it not general, but universal. The absolute abstraction is the universal idea. There are various means of expressing the absolute abstraction. One is the letter P, when it is used, as is customary, indeterminately to indicate something that may be the case and may be thought. In this letter, all content is annihilated. Ordinary language supplies expressions that serve the purpose that P is called upon in current philosophical writing. So it is. Things are so. In ordinary language, then, expressions that give voice to the absolute abstractions are what is, or being, to on, einai. The absolute abstraction is the idea of being. Aristotle introduces the science of what is insofar as it is, to on, he on, by distinguishing the concern of that science from something that could be delimited, cut out, as he puts it, by a general concept. In another passage, he makes the same point, explaining that being is not a genos. He means the absolute abstraction is no general concept. The same holds of the idea of the world or the idea of reality. So thinking and being, knowledge and reality, mind and world, in each of these, the second term, being, reality, world, signifies the universal idea. This Section 2 makes the formula of philosophy mysterious. It is hard to see how there can be a term on the same plane as the universal, for the universal idea has no content. Neither is it determinate, nor does it determine. Nothing is other than it. Nothing lies outside it. Nothing delimits it. To oppose thinking to being, knowledge to reality, mind to world, seems to place thinking outside being, knowledge outside reality, mind outside the world. But then, thinking is not knowledge unreal, the mind not in the world. Surely this is nonsense. If indeed it is nonsense, then so are our formulae, and as they are the formulae of philosophy, so is philosophy. And that conclusion has been drawn in a literature associating itself with Wittgenstein and calling itself quietist in order to signal their obedience to the demand that concludes Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, signifies it in a manner that gives it a pious and sanctified air. I shall return to that quietism later. Now, more widespread, indeed dominant in current Anglophone philosophy, is a response to the difficulty posed by our formula that does not shut up, but on the contrary opens the floodgates of loquaciousness, that is, research. This is the response of the sober man, who will not be taken in by the nonsense of a mind outside the world, who will not hear such raving, but who insists, reasonably and proud of that reason, that surely, as he will say, surely thinking is among the things that are. Knowledge is a certain reality, a subject, a kind of object, the mind a constituent of the world, and a word, indeed, a certain object. The logical claim thus introduced by surely, is that the idea of thought is a general concept. It cuts out a segment from among what is. It signifies an element of reality. It refers to part of the world. Now, if the first term of the formula of philosophy is a general concept, then the second term cannot be the universal idea. If thinking is a general concept, then thinking and being is as meaningful a formula as is swimming and being, knowledge and reality as meaningful as boxing and reality. If these are to be given a meaning, the second term must be reconceived as a general concept. For example, boxing and reality, as a book title, say, could refer to the ways in which boxing informs and is informed by certain social milieus. This is roughly how the sober man interprets the formula of philosophy. He thinks that when we speak of knowledge and reality, we speak generically about a certain reality and a certain other reality. The first may be someone's knowing that snow is white. The second, snow's being white. There may obtain interesting relations between these, relations of similarity, dependence, and so on. Or when we speak of subject and object, we speak generically about certain objects and certain other objects. The first may be Mary, the second a pink ice cube. An ice cube of which Mary is conscious, perhaps by perceiving it. There may be interesting relations between these, Mary and the ice cube. So, thinking and being in the mind of the sober man, this formula does not give voice to a concern with being. It expresses a concern with certain things that are. The concern may be with snows being white, and with someone's thinking or knowing that snow is white. Snows being white is something that is, someone's thinking that snow is white is something that is too, hence something that may in turn be thought. Snows being white is a certain reality, someone's knowing that snow is white is a certain reality too, hence that may in turn be known. Knowledge is a reality alongside other realities, thinking is something that is alongside other things that are, a mind is a denizen of the world alongside other denizens. Thinking and being, knowledge and reality, mind and world. These formulae convey a distinction, a division, opposition. Their sober interpretation understands this division to be contained within a larger whole. Knowledge and reality, namely, knowledge of something and that of which it is the knowledge, are two bits of reality. Thinking and being, that is, thinking something and that of which it is the thought, are two kinds of being, mind and world, to wit, a certain mind and those things that are for that mind, are two parts of the world. Now, the terms then are contained within a higher unity, the unity that the sober man asserts and takes himself to grasp when he proclaims that, surely, a mind is a part of the world. In the same way, nothing stands opposed to reality or being. Nothing is placed on the same plane when it is said that knowledge is a certain reality, thinking a certain kind of being. The plane indicated by those terms now, world, reality, being, is not subject to difference, division, opposition. When we think that plane, we think what is uncreated, indestructible, complete, immovable, without end in every direction. The sober philosopher, seeing that knowledge is a certain reality, thinking a kind of being, distinguishes epistemology from philosophy of, distinguishes epistemology and philosophy of mind, on the one hand, from metaphysics on the other. Metaphysics is the discipline that investigates what is as such. Its object is the oppositionless whole, signified by reality or being. Somewhat incongruently, that most worthy object is thought to present sufficient articulation in order to be comprehended in concepts proper to this most worthy science. For example, the sober metaphysician will inquire into the relation of grounding, crediting himself with the perception that here he has laid hold of something pertaining to what is as such. One thing grounds another. Epistemology and philosophy of mind, by contrast, investigate how human beings, or animals in general, manage to know or think certain things. The color of snow, for example. Since these disciplines inquire into a delimited region of reality, it is proper that they should take their bearing from the sciences that cover that region, cognitive science and psychology. And this is so very proper that it cannot be long before the philosophy will declare itself to be folded into these sciences. There's an order to these philosophical disciplines as the sober man understands them. Epistemology, investigating how certain things may be known, presupposes that those are. Furthermore, how something may be known will depend on what it is. Wherefore, we must know the latter before we inquire into the former. Christopher Peacock captures this order in the phrase metaphysics first, recent book of his. That same order is manifest in the appellation of the field formed by addition, M and E. M first, E second. It is noteworthy that this is the reverse of the order exhibited by our formulae. Thinking and being, knowledge and reality, mind and world, word and object. Quine did not think of entitling his work Object and Word. I shall return to that. Now, this order may be shaken when we note that the epistemological question can be put to metaphysics. Only a little, though, and for a short time, the sober man is not easily shaken and firms up quickly. For the metaphysics of the sober man is a science that puts forth theories of its object, theories of grounding, for example. Its object, sorry, what happened here? Sorry. And thus it seems proper to ask how the sober man knows what he claims to know in putting forth his theory. Since everywhere, and therefore here, the sober man considers the question of knowledge and reality as asking after the relation of one reality to another, he will understand what he proclaims to know, the nature of grounding, say, as a certain reality, of which it may be asked how we acquire knowledge of it. He will understand himself to deploy general concepts. Thus, a subfield of epistemology emerges, the epistemology of metaphysical knowledge, next to, say, the epistemology of sensory knowledge. That branch of epistemology may be particularly hard or not. We may just say that we possess a faculty of intellectual insight into the principles of being. Why not? Now, all of this is strictly nonsense. Nonsense spun from a failure to grasp the logical character of the universal idea. In the first step, thinking is understood to be something thought in a general concept, a concept that cuts out a certain segment of what is distinct from other such segments. In consequence, that to which thinking is opposed in the formula is understood to be something thought in a general concept too. So it remains understood incoherently even when it is to be in a special case, as it were, being as such. Section 3. I said above, speaking for the sober man, someone's knowing something is a certain reality, hence something that may in turn be known. I did not put this into the sober man's mouth. The sober man is keenly interested in the knowledge someone may have of her knowledge. He wants to know whether she who knows something thereby knows that she knows it or not. And indeed, if someone's knowing something is a certain reality, a reality distinct from the reality she thus knows, then that question has meaning. The sober man recognizes this and manifests this recognition in eagerly asking the question. Yet we must pause and think how we might comprehend this recognition. How do we understand the hints in someone's knowing something is a certain reality, hence something that may in turn be known? The sober man reasons, someone's knowing something is a certain reality, hence something that may in turn be known. Now, we noted that in thinking this, he uses reality as the universal idea. Now, the hence reveals the source of that idea. Reality is the formal object of knowledge. It is what knowledge as such knows. In the same way, being is the formal object of thought. It is what thought as such thinks, and the formula subject and object, mind and world are formed in the same way. It is straightforward that the idea of knowledge and the idea of the formal object of knowledge are but one idea, and that so are the idea of thought and the idea of the formal object of thought. It is but one thought in which both are thought, which one thought thus reveals itself to be that very division, diremption, opposition that our formulae express. Someone's knowing something is a certain reality, hence, reasons the sober man, something that may in turn be known. Now, understanding the hence, we recognize that the universal idea is none other than the idea of knowledge. It is none other than the idea of thought. In this way, understanding the hence, we recognize that the first part of the statement is bogus. The universal idea is opened up as thought turns to itself. It is opened up in thinking, thinking, thinking. And this shows that the idea of thought is no general concept. It is the universal idea. Thinking, thinking is thinking the formal object of thought. The formal object of thought, that formal object is thought through no general concept, but in the universal idea. Thinking, thinking is not thinking something that is. It is thinking being. That is, thinking, thinking is not thinking this as opposed to that. Thinking, thinking does not contrast with thinking something other than thinking. Rather, thinking, thinking is nothing other than thinking. Thinking that knows wide, say, I understand myself to think what, thereby I think. It is not in a thought about my thinking that I understand this. Rather, I understand it in thinking what, thereby I think. Hence, Thinking, I think Snow is White, is thinking not anything other nor anything more than thinking Snow is White. Equivalently, what I think, thinking I think Snow is White, is none other and nothing more than what I think, thinking Snow is White. Thinking as thought, what thereby I think, adds nothing to what I think. The idea of thought has no content. It is no general concept. Thinking as thought, that which I think is, thinking is thinking the universal idea. Knowledge is of reality and is understood to be so in knowing. Thought is of what is and is understood to be so in thinking. A word refers to an object and is understood to be so in being spoken. In the understanding internal to speaking a word, thinking something, knowing something, the universal idea is opened up. The absolute abstraction is thought, thinking itself. Hegel says that Parmenides, announcing that being alone is and not being not at all, that Parmenides therein expresses the excitement of thoughts embracing itself in its absolute abstraction. The idea of being that Parmenides announces is the universal idea. Hegel says this idea is thought embracing itself. It is thinking, thinking, thinking. Now, Parmenides does not present himself in so many words as speaking thoughts, thought of itself, yet that is what he does. The universal idea is opened up, not as thought ascends to ever greater heights of generality in thinking a given object, nor as it reaches ever deeper depth of understanding in inquiring into a given object. The universal idea is opened up as thought turns to itself, hence thought turning to itself, understanding itself to think what thereby it thinks, does not turn to a further object, different from and additional to the one that it understands itself to think. Thinking oneself to think Snow is White is thinking nothing other, nothing more than thinking Snow is White. Knowing oneself to know Snow is White is knowing nothing other, nothing more than knowing Snow is White. Now, in a certain philosophical tradition, this is called the self-consciousness of thought and knowledge. Following this way of speaking, we can say that the formulae of philosophy speak the self-consciousness of thought. Insofar as they are the formulae of philosophy, they reveal philosophy to be the articulation of the self-consciousness of thought. When philosophy comes to the clarity of comprehending itself explicitly as self-consciousness, as thinking, 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 then it can be called absolute idealism. The term self-consciousness has been taken to identify a consciousness by its object, which then will be a self. Hence, the flood of dissertations on selves, a flood Anscombe tried in vain to dam up. When the term self-consciousness signifies the medium and the principle of philosophy, then the prefix self does not identify that of which the consciousness is a consciousness. It signifies rather the internality of the consciousness to that of which it is a consciousness. It signifies that it is in thinking what I think that I understand myself to think what thereby I think, that it is in knowing what I know that I understand myself to know what thereby I know. What is thus understood is not a further content, additional to, more extensive than what is thought or known, being understood to be thought or known in that understanding. What therein is understood is the universal idea. That understanding is the absolute abstraction, far from being a special perspective on a special object, a first personal perspective on a rational animal, a perspective and an animal with manifold curious features. Self-consciousness is the opening up of the illimitable whole. Self-consciousness, not as consciousness of a self, but as the internality of consciousness to that of which it is the consciousness, is the same as universality. It is not a feature of a certain limited reality, a kind of activity, a kind of animal. It may seem that we propound a daring claim about a remarkable activity when we say that thought is self-consciousness. If this were so, it would be reasonable to ask, is thought really self-conscious? We may concede it or not. It would be reasonable to conduct experiments to try and find out. Yet the self-consciousness of thought is its universality. It is spoken in the formula, thinking and being. The intellectual task put up by this formula is not to determine whether a certain object has a certain property. The task is that of thinking clearly what is thought in any thought, and thinking which therefore is not thinking this or that, but thinking, period. I noted above that the sober man, specializing in M&E, must be puzzled by our formula, which invariably plays first what he understands to be second. First, there are certain things, so he reasons, then there come along, late in the history of the earth, certain things that think about those. Perhaps those thinking things eventually think about themselves, the things they are, and they may have certain troubles doing that. What is then is first, the thinking of it, second. Yet, the formula is, has always been, will always be, thinking and being, not being and thinking. And this is because the universal idea is opened up in thinking, in the understanding of itself that thinking is. Thinking is its own opening up into being, and this is what the formula captures. The idea of being is the universal idea. This makes the formula thinking and being puzzling. For what could be on the same plane as the universal? Thinking is something, it seems, something that is, something that does not lie, and something that is, does not lie on the same plane as being. Conversely, if thinking is on the same plane as being, then it cannot be something that is. Thought is pushed outside being. Again, knowledge is a reality, it seems, something real, and something real does not lie on the same plane as reality. Conversely, if knowing is on the same plane as reality, then it cannot be a reality. Knowledge is pushed into unreality. Now, our reflections on the source of the universal idea reveal that this problem is bogus. The universal idea is opened up in thinking, in thinking, thinking. Thinking is not thinking something. It is thinking being. Thus, the formula does not absurdly or inconsequently place a being on the same plane as being. Rather, the formula registers that the universal idea is opposition. As thinking opens up being and does so in the thought of itself, being is opened up in the thought of thinking and being. The formula is sound. Thinking lies on the same plane as being, not this or that being, but being. The second term is the universal idea, and so is the first. The universal idea is opposition, thus self-opposition, the opposition of the universal to itself. Therefore, we cannot be in this situation. We have before us being, thinking it, and ask, where therein will we place thinking? For having before us being, thinking it is thinking. And that is thinking and being. The illusion of a problem arises when we pretend to think the universal as being outside its self-opposition as thinking and being, pretending then to seek a place for thinking within being. Even if it be granted that this is right in relation to thinking, and the sober man will not grant it lest he begin to rave, which he will not do. Even if this is granted in relation to thinking, it will seem to leave open a parallel question relating to the thinker. For surely, the surely of the sober man. A thinker is a kind of being. Either thinker or subject is itself a sortal, or it is in each case of its application governed by a sortal, human being perhaps, in our case, a sortal that identifies a genos and sustains reference to an object. So while thinking may be the universal, a thinker surely is not. However, it is clear that consideration of the thinker cannot introduce anything novel, and that the question related to it must be already answered by what answers the question related to thinking. And while there's no space to develop that, I can indicate what, anyway, is clear. So we saw, I think, speaks the internality of knowledge or thought to what it knows or think. I know, I think, adds no content. It speaks the universal idea. The first person pronoun signals the articulation of self-consciousness, self-knowledge, or self-thought, the articulation of knowledge, knowing itself, knowing, thought, thinking itself, thinking. The first person pronoun expresses the universal idea. This shows that it is not a means of referring to an object. It shows that there's no sortal that may govern this alleged reference. And what holds of I holds of all pronouns, you, he, she, they, insofar as these are used to speak to and of her who thinks I, and thus contain the first person pronoun. Accordingly, neither is thinker, subject, mind a sortal. It signifies no genos, nor are there sortals that signify kinds of thinker. In particular, human being is no sortal, because since the idea of thinking is no abstraction, there's no kind from which the idea of a thinker is abstracted. As being is the universal idea, the formula thinking and being threatens to push the thinker outside being. We may distinguish three responses to the formula, to the universality of its second term, and consider in turn the understanding of thinker, or human being, implied by each. The first response is that of the sober man. Placing thinking within being, he treats being as universal, securing himself the pleasure of propounding metaphysical theories, and treats thinking as a general concept. This implies that a thinker is a kind of being determined by that concept and referred to through a suitable sortal. As we've discussed this at length, we shall set it aside now. The second is formal idealism. I'm pleased to be able to make some contact now with the preceding talk. Formal idealism, it recognizes that thought thinking itself abstracts from all content. Consequently, and in contrast to the sober man, the formal idealist does not understand thought to be one among the many things that are and may be thought. Yet she maintains that something survives the abstraction in which thought thinks itself. As we abstract from all content of concepts, we are left with the form of a concept. There is something for thought to think as it thinks itself. Its form. And there are concepts deployed in thought thinking itself, formal concepts. So while the absolute abstraction remains an abstraction, a discontinuity is marked between the concept of thought and any concept that has content. A formal concept is not a general concept. It cannot be placed within a series of concepts of ascending generality, cannot be introduced by judiciously chosen examples. This explains the possibility and limits the claims of metaphysics. When the formal concept acquires a content, which will be a pure content, as it reflects no particular content, but a mere form according to which content is given, the exposition of that content is metaphysics, metaphysics of morals and nature. According to the formal idealist, then, thinking may be understood to be the thinker, but the thinker does not provide for a thinker. Its universality is its emptiness. A thinker is in each case not the universal, but a particular reality, its particularity being provided from outside thought as thought descends into nature and becomes trapped in an animal. Hence, while human being is a sortal, identifying particular loci of trapped thought there and then, the thinker is universal self-consciousness, which is nowhere and no when. A third response is the quietism I mentioned above. It is like the sober man in that it denies that there is such a thing as the universal idea. It is unlike the sober man in that its denial is explicit and informed by an understanding of the supposed, the quietist will say, logical character of the universal. The quietist holds that the idea of absolute abstraction is incoherent. The absolute abstraction is said to abstract from everything. Hence, nothing remains to be thought in this abstraction, not even a form. The absolute abstraction thinks nothing. And this means that what presents itself as the absolute abstraction is an illusion of a thought and no thought at all. This response may be elaborated in the claim that the appearance of an absolute abstraction is generated by a misuse of language. In this misuse, expressions are presumed to say something, even while the conditions are rejected under which alone they have a content. What then they are presumed to say is bound to be a queer sort of content. In the face of this, it is the task of the philosopher to provide neither a metaphysics of nature nor of morals. Rather, the work of the philosopher is to dissolve the illusion that there is an intellectual activity that answers to these incoherent notions by unmasking the forms of expression used in the service of the imaginary task of saying nothing at all. So it follows that when the quietist is confronted with the question, what is a thinker? Or better, what is a human being? Or better still, what am I? He remains silent. More precisely, modifying a passage of the Tractatus, the quietist sees to it that an answer confines itself to general concepts, that is, remains within the sphere of the sciences. As the quietist recognizes, following the same passage, that will disappoint her who asks the question, for it ensures that any answer admitted will be irrelevant to her concern. For example, when Simone Weil says that what is holy in a human being is her expectation that good will happen to her, not evil, the quietist will tell Weil that she has failed to assign a determinate meaning to certain of her words. And he will be right. The term good, as Weil uses it here, signifies the universal. Weil's statement is no candidate for inclusion in a science of man, a science confined to a specific genos. Human being is understood in Weil through the idea of good, which is no genos. This is not the place to discuss formal idealism or quietism. I mention them to show how the difficulty of thinking and being structures a space of philosophy beyond the dominant understanding of it by the sober man. For just as the sober man, formal idealism and quietism are exercised by the worry that when the universality of the second term of the formula is appreciated, thinking and thinker fall out of being, reality, world. The sober man, deaf to the words of universality, thinking and being, soberly maintains that the thinker is located within being, treating being as a circumscribed field of specialized knowledge, analytic metaphysics. The formal idealist recognizes the universality of thought, but understands it, the absolute abstraction, as an abstraction, which requires being given a particular reality from outside itself. Formal idealism thus presents as its defining doctrine the incomprehensibility of the union of universal self-consciousness with a particular animal in which it is trapped, a doctrine of despair, both intellectually and practically. The quietist hears the words of universality, but he tries to shut his ears to their call, and fearful that this won't work, undertakes to silence them. When we hear the formula thinking and being and take the measure of the universality of the second term, then there is no placing thinking within being. This does not raise the question, where then is thinking to be placed? For it means there is no placing thinking within anything. There is no placing thinking. The universal and the idea of placement do not join. The sober man, being deaf to the universal, does not hear this. He reasons, if thinking and thinking cannot be placed within the world, within reality, they must be outside it, in another world, in heaven. He is sober enough to doubt that this is reasonable. Now, in my estimation, the tradition that speaks of another world and heaven is infinitely superior to the notions of the sober man, because that tradition holds on to the universal idea. But we must shield that tradition against readings that interpret it through the notions of the sober man. The sober man interprets talk of another world as introducing a second world next to and alongside the first. He interprets the heaven as a different place next to and alongside the earth. That is, he interprets an opposition whose terms are universal as relating to things, something else, each thought through general concepts. Thus, he contains the opposition within a larger whole, the whole that he undertakes to think in the thought that counts the world. 1 and 2 distinguishes places, earth here, heaven there. That larger whole, again, he therein thinks as uncreated, indestructible, immovable, complete, without end in every direction. Now, there's supposed to be this difficulty. If thinking is no concept, the thinker no object, then thinking is no reality, the thinker nothing in the world. So thinking is unreal, the thinker outside the world. When the difficulty is posed in this way, the universal idea is lost. In asking whether thinking is inside or outside being, the question pretends to think being as a certain space or region, which provides a locus for a distinction of outside and inside. That is intelligible when we use a general concept. There we can ask, does that fall within its extension or outside it? In the universal idea, this distinction falls to the ground. This does not mean, precisely not, that the universal is without difference, distinction, opposition. On the contrary, it means that the universal idea is originally division. Through that same insight, we understand the human being. As we see the universal to be opposition, we see that we cannot be in this situation. We have before us the world, thinking it, and ask, where therein shall we place the human being? For this precisely is what we encounter. This precisely is what it is to encounter a human being. It is having before me the world, thinking it. It is an illusion that I face this difficulty. Where will I place that human being whom I encounter here and now? Is she in the world, outside it, partly inside, partly outside, its limit, beyond its limit? For the universal being, reality, world is opened up as the division of thinker and being. Thus, the universal is opened up in the encounter of a human being. This means that the encounter, the proximity of the other to me, is not an experience of something given that I undertake to comprehend through suitable general concepts. It is the breakdown, the consumption, and the dissolution of all such concepts in the presence of what is holy, as Weil says. And this answers the quietist. If you think the universal idea is meaningless, look a human being in the eyes. There you see the whole. Here, then we find the vindication of the formulae of philosophy. Here, reality itself is real. Thank you.